My name is Casey Bowser, and I currently serve as the president of ACWR. Archivists for Congregations of Women Religious assists lay and religious archivists in the management, interpretation, and preservation of the historical record of Catholic sisters and nuns in the United States and worldwide. Established in 1990, we are a nonprofit professional organization that serves a diverse membership of archivists, scholars, leaders, and allied professionals. Membership is open to anyone who supports our mission, and benefits include a robust listserv community, access to our mentoring program, which provides one-on-one assistance to new and old archivists alike, opportunities for virtual networking and professional development, inclusion in our Women Religious Resource Directory, a digital guide to women religious repositories for scholars and the general public, reduced membership registration rate for our triennial conferences, among much more. As part of our current strategic plan, the ACWR board aims to address the threats to the historical records of women religious resulting from community closures, mergers, and changing demographics. We've promised to engage all the stakeholders as we face future planning and decision-making for these valuable collections. We're glad you're here with us. This webinar today with our esteemed speaker, Eileen Markey, is one of several planned initiatives to further the conversation. ACWR is also collaborating with the Sisters of Charity Foundation and several repositories to develop a national survey to address the current state of women religious archives. The survey will be distributed and analyzed by the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. Please look for further announcements via email in a few months. Participation from both women religious leadership and archivists will be essential to strategizing actionable steps. Thank you so much for your virtual presence today. I will now turn the spotlight to Lisa Schell, ACWR Vice President, President-elect, to formally introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Casey. Hi, everyone. As Casey said, my name is Lisa Schell, and I am the congregation archivist for the Adrian Dominican Sisters here in Adrian, Michigan, and also serving as president-elect, vice president for ACWR. And it is my pleasure today to be able to introduce our webinar speaker, Eileen Markey. As many of you already know, Eileen Markey is the author of A Radical Faith, The Assassination of Sister Maura, a biography of one of the churchwomen killed in El Salvador in 1980. A Radical Faith tells the story of a woman moving closer to God as she grapples with the meaning of her vocation, her place in the world, and the commitments incumbent in sincere belief. The book traces the transformation of women religious in the late 20th century and provides a loving and detailed account of vowed life. An exhaustively reported work that relies on the years of archival research and scores of quantitative interviews, A Radical Faith revived Maura and from a simple victim back into a woman with agency immersed in complex political, historical, and religious currents. Her work increasingly focuses on the role of public memory and commemoration in making sense of the present. Eileen is an assistant professor of journalism at Lehman College of the City University of New York. Her writings have been featured in publications like The New Republic, the New York Daily News, The Village Voice, New York Public Radio, the Intercept and America, and the National Catholic Reporters, just to name a few. For me, and personally, Eileen's work represents the confluence where good scholarship meets good archiving, where the secular and the sacred meet and magic can happen. She makes a compelling case for women religious archives as being, quote, more than just a funeral project, but an untapped, instead, treasure of untold stories about social justice, about governing models of women in leadership, about immigrant communities, about simply women's stories, educational and healthcare systems, and of course, the never before researched shades of American history. The very act of her research explores the tension that many of us in archives grapple with every single day, the tension between access and privacy. And when done successfully, she has demonstrated how radical archiving paired with scholarship can transform story into story with a capital S. how radical archiving sits at the center where all of us here, leaders, archivists, and scholars meet and negotiate the parameters and the contours of these collections. The hard truth is that in the not too distant future, it will be the sisters' archival records, their voices, and those of secular scholars like Eileen who will carry these stories forward. As congregations come to fulfillment, Eileen's work offers a roadmap of how congregational charism and mission serves as another transmission into secular spaces. Personally, I find Eileen's words rooted in a deep appreciation for vowed life, an absolute presence and respect, her research as a sacred act, and her words feel like how I feel when I'm reading a good book. I often feel inspired and I want to go put on my archival gloves and get started again and again. So please join me in welcoming Eileen as she takes us on this journey of securing the legacy, sharing our wisdom, a Sisters Archives as Bearers of Charism. So if you could please reserve your comments for the chat function during the presentation, and then afterwards we'll open it up for Q&A, and then we can also use the raise the hand function. So I'm going to turn it over to Eileen. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's really, really lovely to be with you. I have a PowerPoint that I'm just going to use a little bit. So I think I'm going to come in and out of sharing screen, but I'll start by sharing the screen. So we'll do this and share way up at the top. So I'm really, really happy to be with all of you sisters. It's a great honor and a great privilege to get to be in your company and to get to think out loud with you about these important questions about history, about community, about longevity, about continuance. I've been blessed many times because of my work as a writer, as a reporter, to be in the company of sisters. And really because of my work as a reporter who writes about social movements, I've necessarily and wonderfully bumped into the work of sisters many times in that work, long before and after writing about Maura Clark. To be in the company of sisters is a tremendous gift. So it moves me deeply to be with you today. And as I've been thinking about what I would say to all of you, I've realized that this talk is a prayer, really. This is really a talk about the Holy Spirit and whether we will trust the Holy Spirit to do its work. So ven, Espiritu Santo, come Holy Spirit. I think, since we're in prayer, that we should call in the presence of your foundresses and your founders. St. Catherine of Siena and Elizabeth Seton, Jean-Pierre Madeleine and St. Benedict, Jean Galac and Julie Billiart, and Mary Frances Clark, and so many others. The lives and the dreams of your sisters 700 and 800 years ago, 300 years ago, 150 years ago, have everything to do with what you are doing today and next year. Vowed women religious have been in many different forms and different sorts of orders over a near millennia of history. The world of the tertiaries that Catherine of Siena formed in the 1300s, this was really different from the large abbeys that followed in the 15th century, from the missionaries collaborating with empire in the 16th century, from the Josephites fleeing the French Revolution in the 18th century, or the flocks of sister teachers, the BBMs, the SSNDs, the charities, the religious of the Sacred Heart, and so many others establishing schools and building the American church in the 19th and 20th centuries, and then carrying the American church forward into the late 20th century and into the 21st century. 6 years ago, I took my sons to the Women's March. And we began, there were people from all over the world, they're all over the country, and my kids have been at protests all their lives, much as I've been at protests all my life. Honestly, often with sisters. So at the Women's March, we started the day in a church in DC with a friend of mine who works for the Madams, works for a Sacred Heart School. And we began with a mass. I don't know where, right? You're with a big crowd of people and you're somewhere in DC, and so we're at this mass. But it was all sisters really getting a blessing as they went out into the march. And it was a massive march, right? It was maybe the largest mobilization, in many, many years. And so I said to my kids, stay close, but my phone number, if we get separated, we'll go back to so-and-so's house, da, da, da. But they were children. And I said, just stay with the sisters. You'll be all right. Just stay with the sisters. And so I think of that very, very much when I think of this idea of your near millennia of history for some of your congregations, your 150 years of history for some of your congregations, your 30 years of history for some of your new formulations of congregations. But through that time, you have moved the church. And when it's smart, the church has moved with you. So like I said to my kids, stay with the sisters. When I think of the work that you've done over these years and over these past few decades, moving the church into the 21st century, stay with the sisters. These communities indeed, though, now, and these communities in the 19th century and in the 18th and the 16th, they're really different than the sisters of today who've turned their mother houses, your mother house lands into organic farms, right? The work of those sisters going out on trains to South Dakota and building schools in New Mexico and founding abbeys in France is really different than the work of you who accompany migrants at the border, or who lobby for gun laws, or the child care tax credit, or for higher wages in state houses, and who take positions on company boards to push for disinvestment from fossil fuels. And all of these works are different from what you will do next. Your founders would be astounded. So let's call them in. Be with us, foundresses and founders. Be with us, those sisters who went before. Be with us, those sisters who were your teacher when you were in grade school somewhere, that made you realize you had a vocation, that made you realize this was a life worth thinking about. Be with us, those sisters I've interviewed, those sisters I've listened to, those sisters whose annals I've read. Come and be with us. Presente. Just as we can call these long dead saints into the present, the work of archivists wrinkles time. Sister St. Catherine of Siena isn't 1,000 years ago, she's in the room with us. Sister Rita Osaric, a Maryknoll sister who worked in Nicaragua, who I never met, she's with us. Just as we can call these dead into the room to be with us still, the work of archivists wrinkles time. It makes it possible for something that happened in 1964 or 1890 to live as soon as someone opens an acid-free folder, whatever year it is. And I've had this experience time and again, sitting quietly in an archive and having the past jump out live to me. This is sacramental work. This is work of the Holy Spirit. I think this is part of what the writer of Genesis meant when they said the word became flesh and dwelt among us. The archive holds life. The commitments that you are making to preserve and proclaim aren't about the past. These records are of importance to the future. I think that is vitally important to understand. That memory is about the future. Preserving is an act of hope. In the same way, I guess, memory is an act of hope. It's in the same way that we talk about funerals as a celebration. We have a celebration of a funeral, celebration of a mass. Last week, we celebrated the funeral for my godmother. She was a Sister of Charity of New York. I'll remember her and I'll revisit her throughout this talk. A Mary-in-law sister once told me that tears are a sign of the Holy Spirit's closeness. So bear with me if the Holy Spirit is close. Sister Helen Elizabeth SC was my mother's big cousin. We called her Cousin Helen. She entered the community in 1951, and she worked as a teacher and principal and then as director of education for homes for children without families, what had been the Sisters of Charity's orphanages, but that by the 1960s and 70s were integrated into the New York City foster care system. She realized during her work in the foster care system that children needed advocates in the legal processes in which their families found themselves. And so after 25 years as a sister, as a teacher, as an educator, who had earned a master's degree at Fordham University in history, she went to law school. She enrolled at St. John's School of Law in 1975, where she graduated in 1977. I knew Sister Helen as an attorney who worked in the New York City foster care system, in the court system. This is in the 1980s when I was growing up. It's only as I've gotten older that I've realized what that meant. All I knew is that she worked in the foster care system, that she worked in the family court system, and it must have been very hard. She was a big part of our family. She visited at holidays. Most of my grandparents were dead, and she was a little bit of a link to that previous generation, about 10 years older than my own parents. And so she would come and visit on every possible holiday. She'd come in the summer for a week. She was a joyful and delightful and interesting and intellectual woman who was curious about everything, who was happy and buoyant, who sent me, her goddaughter, cards for every conceivable holiday, always full with a tiny little scrawl of questions, so many questions. Is that why I became a reporter? Someone was always asking me questions. What are you reading? What are you studying? What are you thinking about? Are you doing this? Are you still taking dance classes? How is the violin going? Full of curiosity and interest. She cheered and she smiled and she was happy. She had these beautiful blue eyes. But she spoke almost nothing about her own work. She was an attorney in the family court system in Brooklyn during the 1980s, which meant that she dealt with AIDS, that she dealt with crack, that she dealt with families being torn apart. These are the same kinds of issues I write about and follow, right? Later manifestations of these disintegrations. But I'm crying because I'm thinking about the life she had that she didn't tell us about. Sister Helen was the daughter of my mother's uncle, a very beloved Uncle Mike, who was himself a buoyant and delightful fellow who I remember in his very old age. He immigrated from Ireland after the Irish Civil War with a 6th grade education. He married an Irish American woman and had 3 children. She left. So Helen grew up much of her life without her mother, raised by a single father in the 1930s and 40s. She entered religious life in 51. Her mother had an alcoholic dependency and was not able to care for her family and was, for much of Helen's childhood, not part of the family. Helen grows up and works for an order that runs orphanages and works in the family court system and deals with the disintegration of other families. What did she think? What led her to this work? What were the things she was feeling as she was saying, children need an advocate for them? I don't know. She didn't talk about it. And we were too polite to ask. She spoke almost nothing of her work. Was it that it was too difficult? Was it that it was too dark? Was it impossible to translate stories of crack and AIDS to the middle-class white suburbs where she was visiting my family? I think of that silence. And I think of the reticence, the disservice of modesty. I think of all that we lost not knowing more about what she was living, about what she was thinking, what she struggled with and what she worried about, what she learned and what she knew. At the funeral home last week, my mother and aunt and some of my brothers and my son walked into a room full of nuns. I always encounter this as a presence of power, tremendous and sturdy female power. It's buoying and grounding. During the service, we prayed as the charities do when one of their community dies. I want to quote a little bit from that. They say, as sisters of charity, we're called to live lives of love so as to proclaim the gospel and to make its values present and effective in the world. I love that, present and effective, right? We're not going to just do some woo-woo stuff. Like we're going to get stuff done, right? It's very nun-like to me. Big idea, big value. And we're going to like have a checklist and we're going to make it effective. We're going to get it done. You've done that. You'll continue to do that. And you'll continue to do that through your impact on the people who've been touched by your ministries. I think of the half-life of a sister, the echoing forward in time. Sister Helen bought me subway tokens for my high school graduation because I was going to attend Fordham University where she had gotten her master's, and she was based in the Bronx subway. She took the subway all the way to Brooklyn every day. That gift, tremendously practical, almost hilariously so. Here's some tokens. Congratulations, you'll be at Fordham in August. It was a $10 pack of tokens. That gift, so practical, was saying, welcome to New York City. You'll go far. She went far. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the life of this nun meant in my family, which I think is probably quite similar to what you all mean in your nieces and nephews and grandnieces and grandnephews' families, but also what you mean in all of these other lives, right? This is a picture from Helen's 25th Jubilee. That's my cousin Bridget Ann there in 1976. What we learned from her, and what so many of us learned from all of you sisters, is this example that women are capable, that we are valuable beyond our relationship to men. This is cousin Helen, this is her father, Mike McTaggart, and Bridget Ann, who's now in her 50s. In 1977, after 25 years as an educator, she graduated from St. John's School of Law. Her father, Uncle Mike, had left school at 6th grade. When Helen completed her bachelor's in the mid-1950s, she surpassed the education of her family by a decade, and she surpassed the women by a generation. It wasn't until my generation that women were as educated as Helen was in the 1950s, as most of you were in the 1950s. And when she graduated from law school, she lapped the next generation. My brother, 30 years later, went to law school. In this funeral service, or the little prayer service at the funeral home before we moved to the church for the funeral, we prayed this other piece of what the charities pray when they say goodbye to one of their own. They say, Elizabeth Ann Seton always reflected on her life in the context of eternity, and she urged her sisters to do the same. In the context of eternity. It's either terribly intimidating or really, really freeing, right? Not the context of this week or this afternoon. Reflect on my life in the context of eternity. I think of the light from distant stars. What we behold with wonder in the sky at night burned thousands of years ago. In fact, it might be gone, but we benefit from its glimmer still. St. Vincent invited the sisters to, quote, recall to mind and give an account of the virtues which the deceased sisters manifested and in which they chiefly excelled. An account of the virtues that they manifested and in which they chiefly excelled. And so we had a few minutes of sisters and family telling some lovely stories about cousin Helen. As I sat at that wake and heard those words, I thought of all of you, and I thought of this talk. Let us give an account of the virtues which the deceased sisters manifested and in which they chiefly excelled. That's what the archive, properly maintained, wisely curated, will do. Archivists are custodians for the future. As I sat in that prayer service with my mother and son in a room full of nuns, I thought of how time is rippled by memory. Certainly, nothing is so simple as flat, linear, clear line, right? Time doesn't move clear. It repeats, it loops back. It reverberates, it moves in circles and loops. Here is my son in a tie and a too big blue sports coat, and here is my brother with his same face. He is teetering between confidence and fear. Here is Helen's father, that same boy, the lively eyes, the bounding heart. We dip back into time holding a photograph, and it rushes up to us like a geyser or sometimes like a backed up drain. I sat in this room full of nuns and I thought about Chronos and Kairos time. Chronos, the allegedly chronological, history and timelines and records. It marches mercilessly forward. And it is Chronos that tells us that many congregations of sisters will come to completion in the next 2 decades. There will be a time when that little boy will say, I went to awake and it was a room full of these powerful, loving, joyful women who had this different kind of life. There will come a time for many of your congregations when the last sister exits Chronos time. Someone will pray at her wake. What record will there be? Kairos time, on the other hand, is not bound by that same cold rationality. It's the other time, Celtic time, Indigenous time, Holy Spirit time, the time of opportunity. Kairos is the time that breaks through. Kairos is the moment, this is the Kairos moment for congregations of women religious. It is in this Kairos moment that you can make peace, responsible, empowered, courageous peace with Chronos time. Save your history, open your stories, roll the past wildly into the future. This is that moment.
Eileen, real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt. Looks like the screen sharing has stopped. I don't know if you meant to do that. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'll
Great.
go back and forth. I realized my eye contact was going to be even worse if I was looking at my own old photos. So I think about what can be saved and what isn't saved, and what we might be smart enough to save and open. I think about all that we do not know of Cousin Helen because she didn't want to say too much, because she didn't want to burden us, because she didn't want to make us uncomfortable, or because we weren't sure how to ask. So I'm thinking, and I want to shake you up a little because this is serious. And because people don't understand nuns at all, non-Catholic people and plenty of Catholics. But we need you. We lay women need you. And when you are gone, we will need you too. As a lay woman who's delightedly married and full of joy about my children, why is it that I find nuns so comforting? It's about the possibility. It's about a way of being female that is free. It makes me proud to know that this exists and has existed. That in Catholicism, almost uniquely, we have this way of being female that is outside of objectification, outside of relationship to men. I think I was naive a lot of my young adulthood because I always assumed I would be taken seriously in workplaces, on the street, in encounters, because I only knew women who were taken seriously, because I had these examples of sisters. I grew up with women leaders, with women executives of healthcare agencies, with women delegates to the United Nations, with women who were experts, with women who spoke to the city council and scolded the mayor, with women leaders, with women rebels and nonconformists, moving confidently and gracefully in the world. I want to impress upon you how important sisters and sisters' history is to us lay women. How much you made the world possible for us. And of course, that's a large part of why your numbers are not what they were in 1960 and not what they were in 1930. You made it possible for us to enter education. You made it possible for us to get advanced degrees. You got advanced degrees 30 and 50 years before the most of us. You made it possible for us to work in responsible positions of business, responsible positions of administration and healthcare and teaching and nonprofit work. You made it possible for us to work in the church. You paved open this way of being that spread out the doors for us laywomen, us non-vowed, non-celibate laywomen, to be able to move freely in the world. And because of that, fewer of us are joining you, but we're indebted. And we want to make sure that what you are survives, and that what you are survives in the record. In the future, people will need to know that you are here. They will need to know that there were these women, that in Christianity, in Catholicism, with all of its horrible warts, these women were central. You can't understand Catholicism without understanding sisters. You can't understand American Catholicism at all without understanding sisters. But some people are going to try. Some people are going to try to tell the story of this religion through the bishops. And if we don't have your story, it will be a completely untrue history. So we need to write down, we need to save these stories quickly. What is not lost will not be shared. It will be lost. It will be lost if it is not shared, if it is not preserved. The good, the bad, the difficult, the wonderful, we need all of it. I wish I knew what Cousin Helen thought about the role of the foster system in relation to racism. I don't know. She might have thought it was awful. She might have thought they were doing the best they could. She might have thought she was doing it, finding incremental ways to make things more fair. But we don't know. It's not written down, and we didn't ask. So part of the reason I get to talk about nuns now is because I wrote a book about Sister Maura Clark, one of the Maryknoll sisters who was killed in El Salvador in 1980. And to tell that story, I relied on my journalism training. I set out to write a biography of her that would be more clear and more comprehensive than what little bits about her had been written in other biographies. And frankly, that would be more comprehensive than what biographies had been written of other women in that incident. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand the context. I wanted to know them not solely for their death, but for the work they did that led them to that martyrdom. Because the Maryknoll sisters have this tremendous archive, which was headed at that point by Ellen Pierce, I was able to tell a far fuller, more complex, and more comprehensive story about who Maura was and what she was part of than had previously been written. That book, A Radical Faith, is rich in detail and rich with scope and deeply grounded context because I was able to read so much from that archive about what the sisters believed, how they organized their days, what they were talking about, who they were visiting with at the time that Maura entered the community in 1950, and as the community went through the tremendous and tremendously difficult transformation of Vatican II. So much of all of it was saved and neatly put away and therefore available for me to pore over and puzzle over 30 and 50 years after the events occurred. The questions that I would have asked that archive in 1983 or 1980 were different than the questions I asked in 2015 when I was writing. We needed it preserved and accessible long enough that the questions could ripen, so that the book I wrote that came out in 2016 was really different than a book that would have been written in 1981 or 1982, because we could see longer, because I had new questions, because I came from a different standpoint than earlier works. And so we needed that archive preserved so that I could go look at the same documents and find different answers in them, because I was listening and looking for asking different questions. So when I think about other sister stories, I think very much about my life here in the Bronx. I've lived here since more or less since I graduated from Fordham in 1994. And now I teach at the public university in the Bronx, Lehman College, part of the City University of New York system. And most of my journalism has been about the Bronx. And now I'm working on a book that has to do with liberation theology in the Bronx. I should say, as a lay woman who lives here and who writes and studies Bronx history, the Dominicans and the Sisters of Charity and some other orders are very present here. Both communities were centrally involved in the history of this place, really in making sure that this place, the Bronx, survived 40 years ago. They did this by serving the people of the Bronx in the years when the borough was nearly destroyed by racist public policy, redlining, abandonment, capital flight, arson. The sisters were members of coalitions that advocated and continue to advocate for the people of the Bronx and that rebuilt a network of social service and social justice. This came right on the heels of your embrace of Vatican II, your embrace of new forms of work. And so here by the mid-70s, you're able to have rolled up your sleeves and be centrally engaged in the work of defending community, defending life in this neighborhood, in these neighborhoods. Without the robust retention of the archives of the Sisters of Charity and the Dominicans and others, an untrue history of the Bronx will be written. If people come to this place and write the story about how the Bronx survived and it doesn't include what the nuns do, it won't be true. And it will be male skewed and it will have religion cut out of it. Do we have the materials from the Religious of Jesus and Mary that they used for leadership training and community organizing? I hope so, because Sister Pat Dillon used those when she was standing with the people of the South Bronx as their neighborhoods burned. And more importantly, she used those materials as she worked with people to fight back against the banks and the government that were letting it happen. Do we have those materials? Those mimeographed sheets? Those little community newspapers, those letters back and forth within committees of the congregation who are thinking about how they can work with PICO, how they can work with Industrial Areas Foundation, how they can get the young sisters out of the classroom and into the sidewalk. We need those records because we need to understand how those decisions were made and how that mission was carried from classroom to street and back to classroom. Without that religious women's history, an untrue story will be told about this place, just as it's being told about other places. That spirit is the thing that we want to save, that fight, that faith, that hope in horrible times, that more and good can come out of difficulty. That's the spirit that we want to save. Given the many varied forms that your work has taken over the span of your congregational history, whether we're talking about Dominicans going back 800 years, or BVMs going back more like 200, 150, right? Sisters of St. Joseph's for 350, Sisters of Charity slightly less than that. What is it that unites you sisters and your lay staff members and your archivists and your professional and your sister archivists? What is it that unites you with the work of your foundresses and with the work of your sisters that have gone before? It's your charism, right? It's this work of the Holy Spirit distinct in each congregation that animates and defines your particular work. I read several congregations' charisms as I prepared for this, and they're powerfully and movingly written. They're maybe a little heavy on the Sisters of Charity that I looked at this week because I'm thinking of Helen, but the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, their charism, their statement says that they're called to reliance on the Spirit and that they dare to risk a caring response. It says more, but those are the two phrases I took out. That they dare to risk a caring response. The Sisters of Charity of Seton Hall said, through deep listening to our charism, we call ourselves to new ventures of risk-taking. The Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word in Houston said, their call is to make the love of God as shown in the Incarnation a real and tangible presence in the world today. The Congregation of St. Joseph says simply, loving unity. The SSJs of Peace say, our charism of peace challenges us to prophetic risk so that God's reign might be more fully realized. The Sisters of the Precious Blood say that they proclaim God's love by being a life-giving, reconciling presence in our fractured world. The Benedictines of Chicago talk about long roots. They say that the charism of the Benedictine sisters is reverence. Through common prayer, stewardship, hospitality, and mutual respect, we seek to find and honor God present in each person and in all created things. And they note that they chose the word reverence for its Latin meaning, re vere, to see again. And shout out to Sister Rita Rafferty, SSJ, who taught me Latin for 4 years. The Society of the Sacred Heart Sisters say that their charism comes from Saint Madeleine Sophie Barat, who desired nothing more than to share God's love with students and through them the world. All of these charisms can be applied really easily to the archive. All of these charisms can be applied to proclaiming the archive, to proclaiming your story through what you've saved and what you continue to document. Just as those charisms were passed torch to torch, as you moved from cloister to include also active sisters, as you moved from France or Germany, Italy, or Ireland to be also in this continent, as you moved from running schools to pushing legislative policy in state houses, it's that charism that will be passed on into the next form that you will take. One of the congregations I looked up explained the charism this way, the meaning of charism, which is a slightly abstract notion, right? That if all the written records of a congregation were destroyed, the charism could be recreated through the living testimony of its members. I should have made a PowerPoint for that. I'm sorry I didn't. If all the written records of the congregation were destroyed, the charism could be recreated through the living testimony of the members of the community. But what if there are no living sisters? Can the charism of the community be recreated through the written testimony, the recorded testimony, the photographic testimony of its members? As communities come to completion or to fulfillment, the flame isn't extinguished. We don't believe that. We trust it takes new and wonderful forms. It will continue to live in your sisters, and it will continue to live in the lives of the people you've touched. I think about this half-life, right? This carrying on. It'll continue in the families at the border whom you've helped. It will continue to influence the legislatures who you've pushed to take in stronger environmental regulations. It'll live on in the women who you helped escape sex trafficking. It'll live on in people like me who benefit from spiritual direction and from retreat, yes. But because of the nature of your work, because of your closeness to poor people, to people at the margins, sisters are witness in a really privileged way to the beauty and the pain of your time and place. This one, that one in 1930, that one in family court in 1986, that one on a high plains in Nebraska in 1890, that one in New Mexico in the 1700s. Your witness is distinct and different from the other forms of history because it's close to people at the border. It's close to people who are getting their teeth kicked in. It's close to people on the margins. You know more. You've seen more. The stories that are in your archives are a corrective to the untrue story that the powerful tell about the rest of us. The sister story tells the rest. And that charism can be reconstituted through the witness of these stories, these powerful and different and far more complete stories. The living testimony of your members won't be here for many of you a decade from now, certainly 2 decades from now. But the testimony of your life, the testimony of your work, the testimony of those families and individuals whose lives you've touched, that will exist. And that's where your charism will live. That's what your charism will move through. It'll be opened in acid-free envelopes. It'll be pulled out of these archive boxes. I've got some behind me up there, actually. That's where your community will be, as long as it's shared. As the future comes rushing towards us, merciless Chronos time, the way that your charism will be preserved, not only preserved, but shared, multiplied, expanded like a flame, is that it will be transmitted in the written and the digital record. In that case, which is a not too distant future, the work of archives becomes the work of the congregation. Just as running a school and a hospital system or all your different ministries over time was the work of the congregation, And then as you've moved into the 1990s and 2000s, other smaller sorts of ministries, but really impactful, have been the work of your congregation, right? You turned over the hospitals to lay leadership, you turned over the schools to lay leadership, but you kept doing your work, what your charism told you to do, you kept doing it in different forms. So too, in the not too distant future, that work will be transformed again into the work of sharing the archive. The written and audio and digital and video history is the record that will live. Those of you caretaking this history are in this way the paraclete. Or put another way, you're Mary Magdalene, carrying the good news. This is who I'm thinking of. The paraclete. Or Mary Magdalene, carrying the good news. She didn't keep it to herself. It was very disturbing news to go to the grave to do the required work of looking at the corpse or tending the corpse or bringing perfumes, whatever you're supposed to do the day after, and it was gone. And she had this news to share. Mary Magdalene, the first reporter. She had this news to share and she proclaimed it. This is this beautiful relief that was, it's in a few churches. I go to St. Francis Xavier on 16th Street in Manhattan, and this is in our Mary Chapel in the back of the church. And it's fantastic because it's telling us who Mary Magdalene actually was, not the lies we were told for 1,000 years. She proclaims, she lets out this good news. In the words or the formulation of Jim Martin, she ran and she carried the whole of the church with her as she ran from the tomb to the upper room. Your archives can do that work now and in the future, that you can proclaim this good news. These women lived. This is the work they did. This was the work of the church. This was the work of America. This was the work of the body of Christ in the 19th and 20th centuries in the United States. Here is what it was. Let us proclaim it to you, even when our voices are silenced. I think about Mary Magdalene, and I think about this guy. During the Dark Ages, it was monks holed up in round towers in Ireland who preserved the Gospels. People weren't in a position to read them when they were hunkering down from Viking attacks on Visigoths. But I'm glad they were saved, because later on, people could revisit them, and then we could, and then we could share them. Your archivists are doing that work now. They're preserving the story of the church as it is and as it has been lived through these women religious. It's precious history. If we lose it, we lose access to a whole portion of the life of God. This isn't a thing about bragging. This isn't a thing about tooting our own horn. The work of the sisters in the United States is part of the story of God at work in history. In many cases, it's the better part of the story of God at work in the church. In some cases, it's difficult and painful, but in any case, it's the story of God at work in history. Among the many crucial aspects of this sister's history is that it's women's history. As someone whose work increasingly turns to history, it's like I'm a reporter who writes about the past now. As somebody whose work increasingly turns to history, who writes about women and poor people and religion, I can tell you how maddening it is to look for women in the past and to find such little record of them. We are half the earth. In most societies and in communities, we are the ones who do the majority of the caring, the communicating, the network building, the transmission of belief, and the exchanging of ideas. And yet, we are silent in so much of history. We weren't silent as the days were ticking by, but we're silent in what was written down and in what was saved. I think of Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. In perusing the Cambridge University Library, she said snarkily that she discovered women had not existed until the 16th century. They had authored no books before that, and precious few between then and between Virginia's 1928. Leaving aside the fact that Cambridge clearly should have had some of Catherine of Siena's work or Teresa of Avila's work, we see Virginia's point. Surely the women of ancient Greece of 400s Turkey, or 1200s Spain, or 1300s Peru, or 800s Southern Africa did things. We know they did things because we know that we do things. But they left no record. And so all we have for so many of those places I've just cited is the records of kings or the records of warlords. I would love to read the women's history of the people who Genghis Khan came to. We have his story. I would love to know what the women who encountered Alexander the Great said about it. We have his annals because somebody wrote them down and somebody thought to save those. We know that women were thinking and acting and doing and fighting, but we don't have it written down, and so we can't write that story. Or we can write it only from the tiniest, the teeniest bits of tiny things. They left no record. If they're written in male history, we're only there as vague presences, people who are acted upon. Things happen to women. Genghis Khan's genetics are the most widely dispersed in history. I'd like to hear the women's side of that story. It's not a happy one. So things happen to women, but in those histories, they don't do anything. They don't initiate anything. They don't think anything. They don't contest or disagree with anything, challenge or build anything. Most often, indeed, we are simply invisible. But we know this isn't true. The trove of records that each of your congregations holds is a radical rebuke to this scandalously incomplete and unholy history. You have 100 and 150 and sometimes 800 years of women doing. These records testify, they proclaim, the archive proclaims the other half of history, of US history, of urban history, of education, healthcare, rural, organizational history, of racial history, and yes, of religious history. These are preciously needed. They're a preciously needed corrective to the myopically male and inaccurate history of Catholicism that's been written and is being written. If we believe in both a transcendent and in an immanent God, an incarnational God working with history and with us, the records in your archives are very simply the other half of God. And they need to be proclaimed for us to understand the whole of God. So what do we do with that? There's this tension in the work of archiving. I don't want to pretend it's not there. I come at it from one position because I'm a reporter, and I'm a reporter who was trained by a guy who made great use of the Freedom of Information Act, a great muckraking journalist who exposed Donald Trump way back in 1979. And Wayne Barrett could get any record he needed, right? They were public records, and he would get them from the government agencies and then be able to tell the truth about what skullduggery was being done because they were public records. Your records aren't public in that way. They're not like the proceedings of Congress that the citizens have a right to see, or like the city budget that the citizens have a right to see. And so I know there's this instinct to protect, and I know there's this fear. There's this tension, right? How do we make it open, but how do we keep it safe? This tension between the impulse to protect and the desire of researchers and historians to explore. We want in, and many of you want to keep us at bay. So I think about the cloister. When groups of unmarried or widowed women began living in communities together to dedicate themselves to God, they weren't initially cloistered or wrapped in layers of regulations and rules. Think about the founding of the SSJs. 6 women working together with a Jesuit priest, helping poor people and orphans. But the presence of women unconnected to men has a way of really alarming people. We can see this on the assault on anything that's set for women in today's world. It has a way of really alarming people, especially bishops. So whenever a community of holy women would coalesce in the early modern or the medieval period, they were quickly put behind walls for their own protection. I never believe that chivalrous gesture. It's never for our protection. It's to keep us from influence. Of course, contemplative life is rich, and it's a beautiful one, and it gives me great comfort to know that at this moment, there are cloistered nuns away in silence praying for us. I'm not criticizing that. But what I'm talking about is that drive to protect women, by keeping us in private spheres, it doesn't do us any good. It just means our gifts are shaded under a bushel basket. So too the instinct to protect and shield and put behind gates the archive. Are you guardians of treasure, or are you guides to hidden wisdom? At this late date, we need guides. At this late date in the history of American Catholicism, we need guides. The guardian will end up sentry at an unvisited tomb. I think of Mary Magdalene again. She rushed, she ran to tell. She didn't seal up the tomb and hunker down. So these congregations of women centuries ago and decades ago and today have done things that the rest of us urgently and existentially need to learn. Things that our church, for the possibility of it to survive, need to learn, and things that our society, for its possibility to survive and thrive, need to learn. There's witness for the church, and there's witness for the whole of society, religious and not, Catholic and secular. There are stories in your archives that we need to hear, in order to know how to move forward in a pluralistic society, that we need to hear in order to understand how to confront power, unjust power, that we need to hear in order to understand how to interact cross-racially and how not to. Particularly around questions of power, of leadership, of allegiance, humility, place and race, of organizational and personal change, of transformation. Many congregations of women religious hold a map that the rest of us urgently need to study. Because nuns have for so long stood outside and away from male authority, outside and away from capitalist power, in closeness to poor people and oppressed people, your records offer a way of seeing, another way of seeing, and one that we need in order to negotiate these next centuries. Which is why we need to preserve your records until the questions that we want to ask for them can ripen. When I was researching Maura Clark's life, I asked questions that I wouldn't have asked in 1990 and that nobody would have asked in 1983. But thank God the records were there for me to look with 2016 eyes on them. And I hope they're there in 100 years for someone to look with those eyes on those same facts and be able to find different stories, different wisdom. Your stories, particularly, I think of your work in the last 30 and 50 years, are so often the stories of reconciliation and social justice, but so too your 18th and 19th century history. Because of the work that you've done, your history is really the history of how the United States treats poor people. Because of the work that the sisters done, your history is the history of how the United States treats immigrants, of how the United States treats women. They aren't written elsewhere. Those particular stories, those ways of seeing, those ways of thinking collectively about the common good, that doesn't enter most political discourse until the 1920s, but you've got it in your records. So sisters in the contemporary era have been brave enough to look back on the past and to say what has happened. A lot of it is triumphant. A lot of it is wonderful. And we think of these brave founders as setting out into America and building the American church. I think of the great book that Maggie McGinnis wrote, Called to Serve, The History of American Nuns. It's behind my right shoulder. And I think of that great film, Trailblazers and Habits, about the Marianal sisters in China. That's a lot of the history, and it's really important. Some of the history is awful. The Sisters of Charity in Halifax allowed me to talk to them 3 or 4 years ago when they were going through a reconciliation process, as is the whole nation of Canada, to think about and confront and repent for their role in the residential school system, the government program in Canada that took Indigenous children away from their families and into boarding schools. And in each province, different religious authorities, depending whether it was majority Protestant or majority Catholic group in that province, in that Canadian state, ran the schools. And so Sisters of Charity ran one of the schools in Halifax or in Nova Scotia. It was terrible. It was a bad place. And the history that the sisters had inherited didn't talk about that. It talked about what was good. And the work of Indigenous activists, First Nations activists in the last 20 years said, no, look, you understood that wrong. We've got some testimony you need to hear. And so the brave work, the courageous, difficult heart work of the Sisters of Charity in Halifax and other communities that have done similar things is that they confronted that history, and they confronted what was left out, and they confronted what was in the archives that they hadn't cared to look at before. It's awful, and it's brave, and it's part of the story of God. It's the heart of the story of the people of God moving through this continent, encountering this continent, and carrying with us our sins of colonialism, our sins of the racist structures in which our governments were set up. Because you worked with marginalized people, the work you've done is a record of that engagement. And we need to understand it, good and bad, ugly and hopeful. The sisters carry this history of how America, how Canada treats its poor. And we have these lessons, you have these lessons in your paperwork, in your old folders, maybe in boxes under somebody's drawer, right under some sister's desk. These are the stories that are last minute lessons on leadership, on community, on faith, and on courage. It's not out of courtesy that I'm passionate about sister archives. No, it's because I know that they hold important wisdom, wisdom that's been blocked out and blacked out of other spheres. You've done necessary work bravely. We need to get infusions of it. There's a way of thinking about custody of the archives as protecting the privacy of sisters. I know that's a paramount concern to many in leadership and to many archivists. Oh, these are family stories. That's a phrase that's used so often. That we need to be guarded with what is opened or shared in the archives because they're family stories. It implies that there are family stories that shouldn't be told. But this is alarming. It's a red flag, actually. Think of your own biological families, or those families you've grown close to in your ministries. We all know the family stories that descend into whispers and glances, and the children are swept up the stairs to bed. These are the most important stories. These are precisely the ones we need. Not telling them deprives us, the kids eavesdropping from the top of the stairs, the collected wisdom and the hard-won lessons of our people. It's the hard stories that we need. We need them as protection. We need them to know what pitfalls lie along the way. We need them to know what mistakes and travails have waylaid our families. Think of what those whispered family stories are. They're the stories of alcoholism and mental illness. They're the stories of abuse and grief, the stories of failure and crime. I tried to tell these stories out loud to my sons, frankly, and with compassion. They need to know what they carry, what might beset them. They need to be able to learn from what others have survived and not survived. Not telling covers up. It's that instinct that gave us the baby repository at Tuam in Ireland. It's what gave us the horrors of the Native American Indigenous schools and the sex abuse crisis. We were definitely trained in our families, in our church, to close the doors and to whisper and to pull down the shades on certain topics, too many topics. And that instinct can bleed into a caretaking of history. The justification is always that privacy is for somebody else's protection, but it's not. It doesn't protect. It separates. It's life-killing, secrecy is. And the heart you are trying to protect turns to dust. It is particularly a thing that is enforced on women, and it is brokered on shame and secrecy. So many of your sisters were heroic and were fantastic and were examples and are the people that gave the lay women of my generation and the generation before me license and understanding that we could be whole and that we could be public and that we could be citizens and that we could be leaders. So many of your histories, the stories that are in your archives, are stories of compassion and kindness and bravery. And I want them all told, because I don't want the story of Catholicism to be a story of clerical sexual abuse. I don't want when people to look back on the American Catholic Church that they say this thing happened. And also they had some schools or something, I don't know. I want the sisters' stories to be told. I want them to be understood because they're good stories, because they're fantastic and they're important and they're life-giving and they're stories of God alive and at work in the world. But some of the stories aren't good. Some of the stories are embarrassing. Some of the stories are complicated. Some of the stories are of sisters who had no training and education, who ran classrooms full of 70 kids and maybe didn't do the greatest job. Some of the stories are of innovative ideas for new ministries that fell on their faces. There's a standard that says we can only speak of perfect women, that unless we are pure, we are unspeakable. That's an anti-woman standard. Of course, we're not perfect. We exist. We are written. We are part of the body of God. And recording and proclaiming us furthers the completion of God. Was the cloister, the veil, the burqa for women's protection or for their erasure? Control? Likewise, its reticence to share details and fully for sisters' discretion, or will it ensure their disappearance? Secrecy kills us. It's nearly killed our church. We don't want secrets to strangle the complicated and flawed and beautiful testimony of the sisters. We need guides, not guardians. I know that archivists are often caught between two constituencies, leadership who wants to protect the reputation of the order and scholars who want openness. Where is the Holy Spirit? I don't picture closed doors or locked files when I think of God, or when I think of the Holy Spirit, or when I think of the sisters' work. I think maybe the experience of Vatican II is instructive here. It was difficult, it was frightening as much as it was exciting. It was a really significant change, but one that the congregation faced squarely, prayerfully, and courageously. Thank God they did. That's what's necessary again now. The defensive and protective won't work because your job now is to be charism holders, and you don't put that light under a bushel basket. The archivist needs to know, can I trust this person, this academic, this researcher, this reporter? I don't know if you can. There are indeed people who will interpret your history in ways that you don't like. But if you don't let people in, you will disappear. It's not good if we take the secret to the grave. It's only dead then. It serves no one. Instead, we can bestow everlasting life by permitting the stories to be told. I think of the Visitation. It's one of the few scenes in the Gospels where there are only women, where women are speaking to each other. It's called the Bechtel rule in popular culture, women talking to each other without a man. Here are Mary and Elizabeth Fecund, carrying life, Mary the Christ bearer. Most of you have never been pregnant, but you can be carriers of life, movement forward, one woman or one congregation of women, sharing your joy and trepidation with others. To even write down women's stories is revolutionary. To save them, to share them, to admit that they are not stainless, this is life-bearing. And your stories are women's stories on all sides. This story, this contradiction here is women's story on all sides. This instinct to protect, which actually suffocates, and the fact that our stories still haven't been told. One of the reasons sister stories haven't been told sufficiently is because the values which you excel at and which make you so effective and resilient are in counterposition to getting attention. You've been trained in humility. You don't rush for the spotlight. I can't tell you how often I've interviewed sisters to try to get information about a program or a period in history, or the development of the public health system for an entire nation. And the sisters minimize their work or double over to give others credit and stress the collaborative. This is beautiful and no doubt good for your souls, but it makes crummy history. At this late date, you need to practice pride. Claim your victories, your innovations, your 10 to 15 years ahead of the clergy, your specialized knowledge born of identification with people at the margins, and yes, your stumblings and failures. The window's starting to close, but it's possible for the charism to live. It's forward going. Key in this regard is the present archiving. I think it's the United Church of Christ that has that slogan you see on their flags, God is still speaking. Indeed, and history is still being made. We need to capture this part just as much as the heroic foundresses and the building of schools and colleges and dioceses. Archiving is a present act. Collecting the present is as important as cataloging the past. Think of how inaccurate an understanding of immigration policy in the 21st century future historians will write if they don't know that thousands of people, so many of them Catholics, organized by and working with sisters, rushed to the border during the Trump presidency to greet and comfort migrants. If someone writes a history of the 21st century's, the US people's relationship with the Trump administration and its immigration policies, and doesn't include the work of resistance at the border, the work of radical welcome at the border, we will have an inaccurate history of that moment. The United States Americans didn't take that racist and xenophobic policy for granted, right? We didn't just say, oh, okay. No, we took weeks off of school and weeks off of work, and we went to South Texas and we welcomed people, and we provided free medical exams, and we brought food, and we bought people bus tickets, and we found people ways to get to their family all over the United States. And that was a Catholic work. And that was so largely work of sisters. Rotations of you went down for 2 years, 3 years still to welcome people and to comfort people and to be in solidarity with the arriving migrants.
Eileen, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to remind you, we have about 15 minutes left so that we have some time for
Good.
Q&A.
Yes. Good. We need to document that present history in order to understand the work of the sisters, the work of the church, the work of American history and American presence. Think of how inaccurate and desolate a history of the Catholic Church's relationship to its gay and lesbian members will be written if the work of women religious in these communities is omitted. Think of what an incomplete and untrue history of the Black Lives Matter movement will be written if the committed work of sisters in these current years, marching, praying, offering liturgy, doing penance, convening teaching sessions, is not included. Your contribution now is the power and the accessibility of your record. I don't want you to pass out of this world. I went to Butte, Montana this summer to do research on Irish women political activists in the World War I era. They were Irish women engaged in work for Irish freedom and in suffrage and in advocating for workers' rights. The Sisters of Charity, an offshoot of the Charities of Leavenworth, Kansas, worked in Butte during those years for about 115 years. They were running hospitals and they were running the schools. When I was at the Butte Silver County Archives, I asked for the record of the sisters. Thinking about these Irish women radicals traveling through town and of the campaigns for women's rights and the meetings and the fundraisers and the networking among smart young women, I thought, well, there must be nuns in there somewhere. But there's one box labeled Sisters of Charity in the Butte Archive. There are miles and miles of shelves, and there's one box labeled Sisters of Charity. It's a lone bronze award, the kind of thing you get at an appreciation dinner. And there's this in the cemetery in Butte. I think of all the work that the Sisters of Charity did in Butte for 100 years. The women they comforted, the children they taught, the small interventions they brokered at the mine, the prayers they prayed, the fundraisers they organized, the political battles they subtly weighed in on, the female leaders they groomed and trained, maybe the revolutionaries they hosted. It's all silent. We'll never know. When the Charities of Leavenworth pulled up the mission there were some records, healthcare things, and those went to the hospital, nothing more. It's a light gone out of the world. So how will you keep yours aflame? This flame. There are practical things that you can do. ACWR is going to proffer a survey in coordination with CARA, the research the Institute from Georgetown Research on Religious. They're going to proffer this survey in the next few months. Use it. You're going to get a thing in the mail, a survey saying, what are you doing around your archives? Study that, fill it out, pray with it, discern with it. This is a much happier version than some of these other surveys you all have gotten in the past. ACWR will be presenting this, and it will help them do their work to help you. Receive that survey, pray with it, and be part of it. You can offer scholarships and fellowships to get people into your archive. It doesn't need to be millions of dollars. A couple $100 will bring junior faculty like me to read your archive, because we need the line on our resume. And a couple $100 means we can buy a plane ticket to spend a week in your records. We might be interested in any sort of thing. You'd be amazed what academics study. I am. But it can touch on your resources. Make presentations at the American Catholic Historical Association, the History Professors Conference. These are professional organizations of history professors, and youngish Catholic historians love you. You are who has kept us Catholic. Come to our conferences. Connect to high schools and colleges, Catholic or not. Schools are trying to do much more hands-on experiential learning to get students really doing history. So you can approach them and say, we have history about our area. We have history about Baden. We have history about this part of Chicago. Come and look at our records. Bring in the children and see how this sister's history is connected to the nation and the world. Reach out to your local history museums and local news organizations. Offer to write a column on your local website. News is suffering as much as history, and we take the copy. Promote senior theses at colleges and internships for research. Connect with the local library and the parish. It doesn't have to be evangelical in that sense of trying to get people to go to church. Just sharing the history is an evangelical act and is a part of proclaiming. Parishes are trying to do adult education. We're trying to do things to get people connected as adults to their faith. And talks and seminars for parishioners about the work that the sisters have done are one way to do that. Get in touch with the spiritual life community person at each of the parishes near you and at the diocese and ask to come and talk about your history and your archives. And if the first person doesn't call you back, call again. As I tell my journalism students, don't take somebody not responding from email to mean they're not interested. Figure out the next person to call and the next person to visit and the next person to stop in on. The sisters' history is so often this history of outsiders, of confronting injustice and of struggling through strangeness. Historians love this. Professional historians, feminist historians love this. We want to tell these stories. A lot of my colleagues as history professors and feminist history professors just need to know that you're there, that you are so ahead of the curve, that you're part of movements that are engaged with people on the margins of power. So look up the Women's Studies Department at all the colleges, Catholic and not near you, and read the bios of the professors and write letters to them and say, we have X, Y, and Z. Tell them that you'll be of assistance in their work or the work of their students. The half, no, the 3/4 of American history has never been told, and you've got the keys to a great deal of it. We need to learn from it. Can you ensure control of your stories when you do this? No. You can't. You don't know where research will take your stories. They'll end up in a different way, much like your vocations and missions and lives ended up very unrecognizably different in 2022 than what you thought when you entered in 1950 or 1960. It took faith and courage and openness to the Holy Spirit, even in tremendous trepidation, to allow your story to unfold. Think of the orderly life you thought you would lead when you entered, the rules, the habit, the teaching or nursing you planned on. And now look at yourselves today. You had to trust the Holy Spirit, providence, that your work would unfold as it needed to, and that your congregation would adjust. Mother Superior to elected terms, recreation hours on Sunday afternoon for darning socks to single apartments and book clubs, abiding relationships with lay people when once we were not permitted into your homes. Please let us in. Proclaiming the archive is the next brave step. To trust that your stories are powerful enough that they can be told, that they can carry you forward. I think of a breeze moving, rippling through sheets, drying in the sun. I want to see that breeze move on and on. It can, as long as someone can encounter your stories. Soon we will only have the stories. But if they are saved, if they are properly maintained, if the archivists are given the resources and the tools they need, this can be a tremendous act of midwifery. In this way, you can give and carry forward the life of God for many, many years beyond the chronos. That you can live by taking advantage of this kairos moment, you can live forward into the kairos.
Thank you very much, Eileen. So much, so many gems in there. I mean, I took a ton of notes, but I want to leave some room here. If you have a comment or a question, please, I know we don't have a lot of time, but please feel free to ask Eileen anything you want. This was a very rich discussion, and I know I feel inspired, so I hope all of you do too. Okay, looks like Kathy O'Connor has a question. Could we get an unmute? Veronica, can you help with Kathy O'Connor, please?
Oh, I have it. Okay.
There we go.
I would like to suggest that what I have been doing here with the Notre Dames in Belmont, California, is they had a oral history program that went through from the 1980s to 2003. When I came here in 2006, it had already stopped. I have resurrected that program and have been asking the kind of questions that Eileen wants to be answered. So I have the kind of questions you need to ask are the kind of questions that in the earlier programs, the earlier oral history would not ask, but now I ask them, what is the difference between Vatican II and now? What's your favorite first mission story? And usually those can be funny and poignant at the same time. Those are the kind of things that you get out of the sisters to get them to talk about themselves in ways that is comfortable. And that's what I've done. In oral history is a great way to get out this when you don't have the written record. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, oral histories is a great way to get to some of these reflections and stories, certainly. And I think we all probably are sitting on gold mines when it comes to oral histories. Anybody else have a question or comment? Anybody from the archival space or leadership? And Eileen is offering to stay on a little bit longer.
I'm so sorry I talked for such a long time. My screen shares blocked my clock. And I guess I spoke slower than I had when I practiced.
Lisa, we have a question from Sister Margaret.
Oh, okay, great.
Yes, I'm wondering if there might be a place for some kind of a, not exactly a brochure, but some kind of a 1 or 2 page summary of all of the reasons, because I think that's something that could be absorbed and discussed by a leadership team. If there was a written summary of the various reasons and what exactly, a lot of the things in the archives are probably of no use to anybody because we didn't know what to save. But other things, what are the reasons for saving it? What should we be trying to save, even as we start documenting what's going on right now as congregations face this new time. But a written, it might be an article, might be some kind of a, just a resource that I think could be very helpful to leadership teams, and even convincing people to provide some oral history, or to provide a written account of when they had to close a school, or so, why are you asking me to do this? That kind of a resource could be very helpful for people to be able to hand to someone and say, this is why it's important that you really help us document whatever. So it's a suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Anyone else have ideas about how to communicate this message to leadership? I think that's a great idea.
Sister
And what's
Virginia has
needed?
her hand raised.
Okay.
I don't have an idea. I have a question for Eileen about when you were researching radical faith or other work you've done in religious archives, like how much tension do you find between that, like protect and explore? And, we wrote policies and procedures for limits when things are available, but they are it also says they're negotiable. And so what was your experience?
I think the Maryknolls are very used to being studied, both the fathers and the sisters. They really have, like, because of their early work in China and their work internationally, they're like many scholars who are not just interested in Catholicism come through their archives. It's like it's a very professional archive that is used to having PhDs and students in there a lot. So I think they were pretty open. Things are written down, and there were things that there's these rules that are standard. I think in a lot of archives, someone needs to be dead for 30 years for certain things to be seen, and for 50 for certain other things to be seen. And so there were some records, like personal stuff around Maura and Ida that I would have loved to read, but I won't be able to read those for another 8 years, right? It needs to be 50 years, things like that. I found it very open, but I know with friends who work in other archives that that feel a little more homey in a way, that there is this, oh, well, let me not show you that. Oh, let me not show you that. And that's a normal instinct, but my really like cry from the heart is, please don't do that. Of course, you can have these regular, we don't want to read social security numbers, and we don't need to read bank accounts, and we don't need to read personnel files from the last, whatever that standard is. But we do need to see all of that stuff from the past so that we can get the wisdom from it. And I think sometimes there's really like extra levels of protection where communities are saying, but that didn't go so well, so maybe we won't talk about that. And what I'm saying is, like, it won't harm her, right? Sister so-and-so who's long gone, to be able to talk about whatever process was going on. And in fact, it might very much benefit us.
We do have a question in the chat box from Elaine Bain, and she asks, is there an archive policy that would be suggested for religious communities? This probably goes out more to my archival colleagues on the call. This kind of goes into the bucket of resources. I think that we all probably could share a template for this particular policy around access, the differences between restricted, confidential content. Anybody else want to chime in on that one? Yeah, it's such a big.
I actually come from a background of working with the National Archives for 20 years before I came to the Sisters Archives. So I have a tension between the public archives and the private archives, and sometimes it's worked out and sometimes it hasn't. I think that from my perspective, as someone who's worked in very public archives versus the private archives of most sisters and most organizations outside of the public sphere, is that sometimes I think what you consider private or confidential is like an example of this would be, and I can say this because it's happened in both of the congregations I worked for, which is the Sisters of St. Francis of Penance and Christian Charity in Redwood City, and I worked for the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur in Belmont, California. What they both have had are sisters who have had mental health problems and were already vowed, and they did not do any, they did not just throw them out the water and tell them they had to go back in and become lay, and that they took care of them for the rest of their lives. That is an act of compassion for me and for others to know that this actually occurred. You don't have to say the person's name, but you should be able to say, this is how we dealt with this. We recognized that she was not appropriate for the ministry we had, but she had to, we didn't abandon her. And I think that's the kind of thing that Elaine is talking about when she talks about that sense of taking care of the people, the sisters who are maybe, and finding that some of the sisters don't work well in high school, in classroom, but try to find another place for them to go to be active in ministry. I think those are the kind of things that we're talking about when we talk about confidential types of things. And I think from my perspective as a public archivist from the National Archives, I find that certain things that like after 100 years should be revealed. I mean, the people are all dead. They should all be, and some of the stuff is very good because it talks about how the sisters tried to help this woman, even though she was not appropriate to be a sister in this time frame. So how did they do that? And it's clearly, a lot of that is clearly documented in their records. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about confidential versus the nice things or the bad things about sisters or what they did. And I think that for me, from my perspective, as a public archive, it's then coming into a private archive. I found that disconcerting that I had to keep so much stuff, so many of the stories secret when they were actually stories of coming out of something that was really good, really bad, but coming out of it in a good way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the kind of thing that I think Eileen is talking about. And I think that's the kind of thing that we as archivists need to kind of look at, and as leadership needs to look at as well, to see how that interaction goes with this kind of thing. And I think eventually we're all of us have large amounts of files of sisters who left in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And those files are also not allowed to be looked at unless we can do it as a statistical study type thing. But I think it's a good thing so that you can see that what you can see is that, and I don't know whether this is true across the board, but some of those sisters who left have come back to the congregation as associates. So they actually have absorbed that charism and they want to continue it, so they continue it as associates, and they're really good at it. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that those kinds of stories can interact and could be told in a way that would not destroy the privacy of the person, nor the inner workings of the current sisters. That might be something to think about.
Great, thank you, Kathy. We have a hand raised from Margaret Phelan. Go ahead.
Yes, just responding to that question. I had several years ago as a general archivist for the congregation, I needed to develop our own access policies. And very simply, I went online, looked through a number of institutions, universities. I didn't go to hospitals because I'm not familiar with their work. The Vatican archives, Jesuit archives, etc., to see what their policies were. I drew from that and then consulted with other people within our own congregation and put together something that was acceptable. So I think just to know that access policies are generally available right online to the general public. So could be a source of information.
Thank you. There's some resources and some links published in the chat function if you want to take a look at those. And Eileen, we got a question about if your presentation may be shareable after today. Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, we have a hand raised from Mary Sweeney.
My question is a different slant on accessibility. I'm wondering about centralizing all archival material when we've spent so many years in ministry in different countries and different archdioceses and so on. Are all archives centralized, or are people broken down or sent things to materials to local archdioceses and archives?
Well, thank you for asking that question. That's actually a topic that we're going to be discussing later on here. That's a whole nother topic, but the short answer is there is not a place. There are multiple options. People can merge with local universities. There's several initiatives around the country for consolidated regional archives. And there's people on this call who have a lot more information on this than I could possibly impart, but we are going to discuss that in a later webinar. So feel free to look for that. And there are other resources we can direct you toward as well.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, Ellen Jacobson, would you like to share?
Yes. This is just a plug. A lot of us moan and groan about even if we are supported by leadership, our members, this is about annals, trying to get our members to record annals, house history, or whatever, so that we do have a record. Every year I get a more and more pathetic response. So as a follow-up to Margie Palliser's, like some kind of an article, that part of leadership's responsibility is to support the effort to nudge membership to do their part, to keep their history, because that's what for many years now has created a huge gap. Ever since we've moved out of traditional convents associated with parishes and hospitals and are more in smaller communities and apartments or whatever, it's just gotten lost in the shuffle. And about 11 years ago, I got a committee together to design a very simple form. And even with that, people just politely ignore me.
And that is so important. Those earlier annals, from the mid 60s and earlier, are so valuable. Like what's written on them is often very, very simple. So-and-so came to tea, sister went to such and place, such for an extension, retreat, so-and-so was in the house. But, I read years and years of those for the book on Maura Clark, and it's because of those that I'm able to say, oh, well, that's when so-and-so went to Guatemala for that training. And then that's when so-and-so came back. And, you have to read them longitudinally. Or, Maura worked in the Bronx for a while, and there's a lot that's not said in the annals, right? But what is said is like scaffolding around which you can then figure out what else you need to learn, that the historian can figure out what else they need to learn. And so like, it makes sense, of course, that that's not being whatever, it was somebody's job back then every night to write it down. And it's just not part of communal life today if you're living in an apartment with 2 other sisters or you're living alone. So I understand how it wouldn't be integrated into the, into like the form of the day. But it's so important. And frankly, you're doing, you're meeting with and seeing so many more people. It would be really great for us historians to have, right? Like, went to the State House to lobby on this, talked to those people about debt relief, worked on this with the with the CSA, worked on, but I feel like some of that might be almost psychological, right? That the sisters don't consider their day-to-day work that important, so they're not writing it down. That's what I'm talking about, like practice pride, or maybe spin it around into a language that people do use, which is, oh, right, I can be of service. I can be of service if I write it down. Somewhere between whichever motivation works in terms of the psychology of the sisters, that no, what you're doing is important. We want to know it so that we can write accurate histories of these movements. And if it's a sister who's only motivated by duty, right, then it can be that you're doing a service to the community. But it sounds like that method isn't working, right? You've designed a really nice, simple little form and still you're not getting feedback. That it needs to be kind of shared this way as what, that this history is important. Even your little tiny bit is important. I mean, it's St. Paul, right? Like each part of the body is important. And so for those of us, it's not only that people are going to be writing your congregational history, like some of that will happen. And I meant to talk a little bit about my colleague, Catherine O'Donnell, who's a history professor, who wrote about Elizabeth Ann Seton, like there's that, and she read all these annals. But it's other things. It's people who are going to write histories and articles about racial reconciliation or about immigration. And we want to be able to say, here's what women religious were doing, lest you be written out. And lest the story be told that Americans just sat down and took all that xenophobia, or lest the story be told that Catholics were only focused on over here and not on all of the things that you're doing. So maybe some way of talking it up, in your retreats and in your times that your communities do come together, talking about as pride and carrying forward the tradition. Please keep records of what you do month to month, sisters, because we want to document what we're doing in these years. We want to document our work.
Well, I want to be really mindful of potential Zoom fatigue. So I know we are over a little bit here, but I want to make sure that everybody feels that they are heard. Did anybody have something that they wanted to ask or share before we start winding down for the day? Okay. And if there's any part of this you missed, please know this is recorded. You can go back and rewatch it. Or if there's somebody who is not on this Zoom call that you think would benefit from this talk, please feel free to share the posting link. Veronica will be posting that tomorrow. And I think this was a very successful webinar. Thank you, Eileen, for all of your heartfelt, truthful words and just being a complete and utter, passionate, absolute, present, archival adjacent advocate and partner, which is why we asked you to come. We recognize as an organization and as an archival community that in order to bring these stories forward, we need leadership to do that, which is part of the reason we asked you to come, because more than anybody that I've heard in the last couple of years, you have really been such a strong voice in communicating ideas and thoughts that I haven't even yet been able to put into words. And so I want to thank you for being that for me personally as a professional. But I think I speak for a lot of people here. Just your words are very inspirational. And I love this idea of we need to stop thinking of ourselves as only guardians, but guides. And that's such a good way to reframe and I think rebrand ourselves as we consider how to engage with our collections moving forward and face the daunting reality of what we're all up against. So thank you for that. And before I sign off, I just would like to remind everybody that we will have several other webinars, free webinars that we're offering this year. And the next one up is in collaboration with the Catholic Accountability and Healing Project and the USCCB Subcommittee on Native American Affairs. along with us. We're offering our second and third series of leadership-centered webinars, March 3rd and April 5th at 3 p.m. So look for the emails, especially if you've signed up for this one, you'll automatically be on the emails moving forward. So thank you all so very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.